Good to see you, man.
Wonderful. Good to see you. How you doing today? It must be early, right? 8:30 for you?
8:30. Yes. I mean, I'm usually, my body's up at 6 and I can't stop it. I can't stop it from doing that no matter what. So
right.
Yeah, eight's not too early.
Yeah, you're not too bad. Not too bad. I just finished interviewing John Steingard. Are you familiar with John?
No.
At all? He's put some great stuff out on Instagram. You should check him out.
Yeah, for sure.
He booked him in. He did 4:30 a.m. his time. He's like, I like getting up early, and I'm like, you are insane. You are insane.
Oh, where are you at?
I'm in the UK, so 8 hours ahead. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it was nice for me that he did 4:30 in the morning. It was like, I actually get to do it in the middle of the day. Same for you actually as well. A lot of the people I end up doing, they're doing afternoon or even evening, and I'm like well into the night. So it's a nice change for me. But,
yeah, for sure. I'm glad I could do it.
No, it's great. I'm excited. So how much time have you got?
I blocked out from now till I want to say 11 o'clock my time.
Oh, wow. Perfect. Okay. Well, we may not go that long. We'll see what the conversation holds, but It's nice to have the freedom. I just love much more relaxed, easygoing conversation. We can go much more into depth into something without worrying, will we get to the next thing? Or, and so it just allows a much easier flow and allows you to not feel pressure to make sure you get to say the right thing at enough time. And
yeah, absolutely, man.
Relax, enjoy. So say whatever you want, however you want. There is no, rules or anything like that. People are pretty chill.
Sounds fun.
So yeah, however you want, if you cuss, if you don't cuss, if you want to come out as, believing X, Y, or Z, you're not going to shock my audience.
Awesome.
We're really super chill. And so.
Dope. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it, man.
I'm excited. Really excited. I've been following you, for quite a while. Not your personal, page. I don't know what you actually put much stuff on there. It seems quite personal. But on your, is it Existentialist?
Yes. Existential.
Podcast?
Yes, sir.
I always wanted Existential Podcast. Yes. I always say the wrong thing. I'm like, existentialism, existentialist. I don't know. But yeah, I'm terrible with names. But you putting some good stuff out on that, man. And your Existential Sundays, things like that. I don't get to catch every single one, but when I click on and grab a bit, I'm like, this is good. I mean, I'm encouraged. I'm like,
thanks, man.
Full of life, full of like just wisdom and grace and love and inclusivity. Just, you're speaking my language,
Dude, I appreciate that, man. It's cool. I'm glad you're resonating with it for sure.
So tell me, why don't we just dive in?
Okay.
Talking of informal. I'm probably already just started, but might as well big up what you're doing initially. But why don't we kind of talk a bit about how you got to where you are now? I'm presuming you didn't start where you are right now. You didn't start in the kind of the frame of minds, the worldview you have now. That's not where you kind of originated. Like what was growing up as Corey Leak like? How did that kind of all pan out?
Yeah, man, that's crazy because I grew up, well, I was born in Chicago. I was born to a guy who owned a bar, and then my mom, after I was born, married an AME pastor, and AME is African Methodist Episcopal. So like it's this, the story of AME Church is that they broke away from the Methodist Church because they were treated like Black people are treated in the United States. So, they broke away, started their own denomination. And so it's a very pro-Black denomination. So much so that actually when I was a kid growing up in this AME house, my dad had told us once that if he ever became bishop, we'd have to live in Africa for a while. And as a kid, I'm like, I am
You're excited about that.
No, I'm terrified about the notion of going to Africa. And here's the reason why. Like, and this is going to sound really ridiculous, but the reason why is because I was afraid they wouldn't have my television channels.
Dude, that makes sense. Like, as a kid that had to move around a lot, like,
right.
I was not okay with moving to like a town 3 miles away. Exactly. You take me to another continent? Hell no. Hell no. That is not going to be happening. So you were sabotaging your dad in church, right? You were like, trying to drop something in his pocket that would get him in trouble. Or
tell me about it. But, he assured us he never wanted to be bishop. So we just kind of our fears were calmed. But I grew up in this super Black church.
Right.
But we lived in a town in Southern Illinois that was very, it was, I mean, dude, well, I found out later in life, it was ravaged by white supremacist violence. So I didn't know this. I just lived in a rundown town, right? And it was like, people would call it ghetto, they call it the hood, whatever you call it. There was like not a good side of town. There were gunshots in my neighborhood almost every night. And that sounds like an exaggeration, but it really isn't. I had a friend come over to spend the night from St. Louis, which was across the river from where I lived in East St. Louis. He came over to my house and spent the night, couldn't sleep a wink. Woke up the next morning and said, dude, how do you sleep through this? Basically, like, because it's just, you just get used to it. I watched one of my best friend's older brothers pull a gun on a guy who's about to shoot him. I think the only reason he didn't kill him was because he saw me. And I'm like probably 11, 12 years old. And they knew my dad was the pastor of this church in the neighborhood. So it was kind of like we had this sort of respect in the neighborhood where people didn't really bother us. But this was a really rough area that I grew up in. So as a result of that, my parents decided they didn't want to put us in these schools in the town I lived in. I mean, there were metal detectors that kids were going through to get into school. So we went to this all-white evangelical Christian school like 20 miles away from my house. So I have these two dynamic experiences. I have this experience where I live and with the church I go to that's all Black. There's violence and drugs and gangs right outside my house and the Black church experience. But Monday through Friday, I'm with white evangelicals hearing about white Jesus and hearing about like in this white Christian school, the science that I'm hearing about, right? They're teaching the creation story as the origins of men, like as a scientific, in a science book, not a literature book, not a Bible class, but in a science textbook.
Wow.
They're teaching the origin of men is the Genesis poem. Like, so this is my upbringing. Wow. So I went from that Christian school to another Christian school to another all-white Christian school that I graduated from in high school, this time in Northern Illinois. And so all of my life, I have this duality. I've got the Black experience. I'm growing up in predominantly Black neighborhoods. I'm going to Black churches on Sunday. Monday through Friday, I'm hearing from white folks about white Jesus. And so this is what I'm living. And so ultimately at one point in my life, probably at 18, I was so influenced by the white folks that I told my dad, I want to go over to this church. I want this other experience. Wow. And there's this like old mantra I heard years ago that whoever spends the most time wins. And I spent most of my time around white evangelicals. So that was what was shaping my worldview and how I saw faith, how I saw the world. Wow. And so I spent like, I don't know, 20 years, in that space. I developed, I learned that I could sing and play guitar. So I started leading worship, and I'm the Black Chris Tomlin for like all of these, evangelical churches. And I think it was really Trayvon Martin. That was maybe the start of it, where and social media was not what it is now back then. But for me, I started to share on social media, Black Lives Matter, things like that. And no one really had a problem with it back then. I was kind of in some maybe smaller white evangelical church spaces. So it's like no big deal. Well, over time, as I started being a part of larger and larger white evangelical spaces, those kinds of posts, those kinds of ideas became more and more threatening, right? Yeah. And so I found myself after a trip to Israel and reading Rob Bell's book, What is the Bible, on this epic theological journey. And at the same time, socially, everything is changing. There's police and systemic violence happening everywhere here in the United States. And so those two things at the same time sort of began to change my worldview. And I start looking at white evangelical church and going, wait a minute, like this, how come we're not interested in talking about Charlottesville? Like why is it that I work on staff here? Why is it that like my daughter's texting me, my 16-year-old daughter is texting me about this hate-filled march against Black and brown people. And my tribe that I've devoted my life to has nothing to say. So those sorts of that kind of started to have me go, what are we doing in this space? And ultimately, man, through, again, I do a ton of reading, both theologically and socially, and I'm finding this very compelling merger that they're not different. Because I think a lot of people who knew me back in the whole white evangelical days think that I've made some drastic shift away from theological framework, but I've actually made a drastic turn deeper into theology, which naturally leads to more of an awareness of what's happening socially. Yeah. You know, so that's kind of hopefully that makes sense, because I went all the way back to birth almost.
No, that's good. I mean, it gives a really good overview of kind of the journey, because I think it's just really important to understand where we come from and the kind of the stepping stones along the way, because we're constantly going through these changes, but we don't see them at the time, you know? And it's only when we look back, we're like, oh, wow, those were quite significant shifts. I can't even imagine living in a predominantly Black world, in a Black church, all those different things, suddenly being thrown into white evangelical Christian school. I mean, Christian school is a weird trip for anyone if even if they're white, right? I mean, like, geez. But to be thrown out of that, I mean, even when you were talking about they're using the Bible to teach creation, like what? Is that not, would the AME not do that? Would they hold to more of a kind of like scientific kind of perspective, or just they didn't go there? Or?
Well, what's interesting, bro, is that like I when you grow up, the way I did. And my mom was a huge influence, because she was very much not into the AME church. My mom is a very fair-skinned, light-skinned woman. So she kind of grew up a little bit excluded from some of the same racist, encounters that a lot of people her age and from her era went through. So she kind of, I asked her one time, I said, Mom, do you remember what it felt like when Dr. King was assassinated? And she said, no, I really don't. She said, I actually have more of an attachment to Kennedy when Kennedy was killed. Mm-hmm. And so it's this really interesting thing with my mother, how she, grew up. And so she would gravitate more towards white evangelical space and bring me with her. So though I grew up in this African Methodist Episcopal church, I didn't appreciate it as a kid. Right. I thought my dad, God rest his soul, he passed away several years ago. I thought my dad growing up was a very boring preacher, because it wasn't exciting. He didn't have the pictographs and, that like the white church had, right? So he didn't have the resources for a children's church and youth group. So all of us as kids, we're in the adult service that's not for us, right? We're going through the boring liturgies and all those sorts of things. And there's nothing tailor-made for us as kids, except for maybe Sunday school. So I didn't have this great appreciation, nor do I even remember much of what they were teaching. What I know now about the AME church is they're certainly more orthodox than a lot of these non-denominational or, type white evangelical types churches and religious organizations that I was going to school and learning from. So it wasn't even shocking to me, dude. I mean, even as I got into high school and probably even early college, it wasn't shocking to me to think that Christian schools had the Genesis poem as their science of how old the earth is, of how we all came to be. It didn't shock me. It didn't start. That doesn't, in fact, to be honest with you, this is the first time I've named how shocking that is today.
Wow,
so it's just,
I mean, I think that's a big thing. It feels like, cause I'm from the UK and I've lived in the US, and predominantly most people watching this, listen to this, following me are generally in America, about 70% or so. But that always kind of baffled me, kind of looking upon that, because we tend not to go that far down the rabbit hole of the Bible's a science book too. It's well, no, probably shouldn't look to that for its science answers. It was never written to give science answers. People didn't ask questions about science. Science wasn't really around yet.
Exactly.
But it always kind of baffled me, that kind of concept. But when you've kind of gone in it, I spent a lot of time over a big church called Bethel, big mega church on the West Coast, and they are in there. And after you spent a while there, you're like, I can see this. I can see how if this is your world and this is what you've been brought up with, and this Bible is this, yeah, gosh, you don't have many options here. And then you're left in this weird dynamic where you've got to be fighting evolution. You're left fighting truth so you can uphold your truth. But, it's such a problematic area, and I can't. When you're in that level of cognitive dissonance, it must be an exhausting thing to be doing subconsciously all the time, trying to suppress real facts and information to uphold something that you need to be true, right?
Yeah, dude. And it's crazy. What's crazy too about that is, I say this often now, is that it's like, it's a little bit like Inception to me, the movie with, Leonardo DiCaprio and The Dream Within a Dream, that like when you're having a dream, you don't ask any questions about how you got there. Like if I had a dream about you, Phil, I would have no questions. Like, why is Phil in my house? Like none of that stuff would come up.
Of course, Phil. He's always in my living room.
Yeah, Phil. Of course, it's always, duh. You're just like in the moment that's in front of you. And I feel like so many of us in our Christian journey have woke up in this dream and we don't ask questions. Like, so everything that we're given on Sunday morning from that stage, depending on what church you may go to or what religious organization you're part of, that becomes what is the reality. You think that 100-year-old theology goes all the way back to Jesus. Right. You think that like the way that church is done and the structure of church is the way it's always been because it's all you know. And I think it's not until you start to like do some of your own work and do some of your own journey that you begin to realize, wait a minute, like this hasn't always been the case. I'll tell you one of the things I left out that was really a major part of my journey was when I went to Israel. I actually had the opportunity with a church that I was working for to go to Israel. And I'll tell you what, man, that was a like amazing experience.
How so?
Well, it's because to be there where like the things that you read about in scripture actually happened, to be standing on dirt that's thousands of years old, right? To be around people who hail from the descendants of these people that you've read about and hear how they talk, how they view the world, the things that they say about the Bible. I remember going to Israel with a very, didn't even realize it, but I had a very fundamentalist view of the Bible, of church, of Christianity. I thought that the Bible was this manual of all fact and everything in there is his history, right? So we're in Israel and I asked our tour guide, I said, where is the Tower of Babel? All right? I expect there to be something like that there, right? And he was very gracious. We're actually friends now. He's very gracious and said, I think it's over there somewhere. Like just didn't want to like crush. He didn't want to tell me there's no Santa Claus. Right. So I just being there and finding out that there are things, one of our tour guides told us that the valley of the shadow of death is an actual place. And he pointed to it. Said it's right there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? And then hearing things about there not really being eagles there. So we're going to rise up with wings as eagles is a European way of expressing that the ultimate bird, while the ultimate bird in Israel is something different. So then I'm like, okay, wait, they're changing stuff? Like someone actually changed stuff in this book? I thought it fell out of the sky. I thought God wrote this, put other people's name on it, and dropped it out of the sky. Like that is what I thought happened to this. So when
why are all you guys speaking English?
So I think, man, it really just changed so much for me to be in that space and hear these people talk about things in a real human way, not in this like out there somewhere in space way.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I've always wanted to go to Israel. It's just like a real dream. I just think there's got to be something about, and maybe that's diminished for me now because I'm not as fundamentally associated with Christianity. I still have all my Christianity coming with me, but there's got to be something about standing like on a hill and going, whoa, people stood on this hill and listened to Jesus. Jesus probably stood a little bit higher up on this hill somewhere and was giving the Sermon on the Mount, or, whatever.
Dude.
And you're like,
yeah, dude,
that's got to be grounding on some profound level, just connecting you with history, right?
For sure.
It's astonishing.
Well, and also, dude, you just mentioned it casually, but they're not that precise. It's like, they're like, well, Jesus could have been here. He could have been there. I mean, we think, it's like you're there and you're like, wait a minute, isn't like here, you kind of know in America, you're like, yeah, Dr. King stood here. And right here in this place, standing right here in this spot right here is where he was assassinated. You go to Israel and they're like, yeah, Jesus might have been buried here. He might have been buried there. He could have been crucified there. Could have been crucified over there. And you're like, what happened to all the certainty? What happened to all the like exact, precise way that the Western church talks about God and talks about things and talks about history and talks about science from a biblical worldview? You kind of go, you act as though here in the West that there is this, you can be very certain and very specific and very precise about exactly what the Bible says.
Yeah.
And over in the East, in Israel especially, it's not that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's only as I started to dive into the Bible and explore this a bit more and then look at it through kind of historical cultural lens, you start to realize all the Jews are laughing at us, right? They're all kind of like just laughing behind the Christians' back when they're like, oh, they think it's infallible. That's really funny. They think our book's infallible. Like, we don't think our book's infallible. Like things like that. And it's just like, wait, you don't think this is infallible? What the hell are you, like, how do you have a religion? But it's exactly. Western, Greco-Roman, kind of absolutist, we're fact-driven. Like, if it said there was 500 people there are 500 people there, and Jews are like, no, could have been 100, could have been 10,000. We said 500 because 500, it means, like, strong power, or, and it's like, what do you mean you changed the number because it means something? It's such an offense to the way we think, and it's just, we forget there's so much going on in these kind of, these ways. And I don't think many evangelicals, conventional Christians are in a place to even begin to entertain those kind of notions. I mean, that's a huge, like when you started kind of exploring this stuff, I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's the race element, which is massive. I mean, a huge, I can't even imagine the kind of, existential kind of like trauma and whatever going on there. But there's a whole other element of like when you start questioning, the foundation of your faith, which, for conventional Christians, the Bible is very much the foundation. That's got to that's got to fuck you up a bit, right? What are we going to do here?
For sure. I mean, and I think you like I said, when you kind of, if you wake up in the West as a Christian, you become born again, you're born again after a time period where fundamentalism really began, which is back in this, early 1900s, to defend against science. So there's this, like, in the West, this change, this fundamental change that happened to the way we practice our faith, from being something that we practice in a way that helps us to love our neighbor and love the planet. Fundamentally, this is what really the orthodoxy of faith is, that I love, I include, I make space for, I take care of the widow, I take care of the orphan, I take care of those who can't take care of themselves, and I certainly take care of the world around me. To now, our faith is about defending some ideas against these other ideas, against things that are trying to come for us. So science is now an attack on what we believe to be true about the nature of the universe and God. So rather than being people who go, as new information comes to light, I will deal with that new information and I will hold that intention with things that I previously believed or thought or knew. I instead go, I am going to fight against that new information, because it threatens what I think, it threatens what I believe are fundamental truths, which again, somebody chose to make those fundamental truths. Yeah. Like, it's not like this whole idea of infallible. The Bible doesn't say that about itself, but this whole idea of being infallible and inerrant is something that some human being chose, and it was catchy enough that people grabbed it and are willing to die and fight for it. And now here we are years later with a bunch of Western evangelical Christians who no longer have the ability to hold their faith and think, to really go, science, people who devote their lives to studying this stuff are telling us that the earth is some billions of years old. So are you going to believe them and the myriad of writers and scholars and thinkers and the technology? Or are you going to believe this one library of writings by people who did not even have a concept of science?
Right.
Like they weren't even trying to tell you anything scientific. You're going to believe them and disregard all of the science. Like this is what the whole fundamentalist movement has left us with. Yeah. And it has led us to Donald Trump. This is why evangelicals are so, he had the perfect message for them, because the perfect message for a fundamentalist evangelical Western Christian is there is someone coming for us. There is some idea, there are some people, there is some way of being, the gays, the people who want to abort their babies, and the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa. All these people are coming for your way of life, and you have to do something to stop it by electing this person. And Christians are like, we don't want people to continue to abort babies, and we don't want the gays to get married and them to affect our ideas about the way marriage is supposed to be. And so it was a natural thing for them to go, we need that guy to help us keep and maintain a way of Christianity that we've always known. And like that to me is what drives my work so much, is that like, it's not the Donald Trumps of the world. It is the people who bought Donald Trump that bother me the most. Because it's one Donald Trump. You know what I'm saying? He's going to die. Eventually he's going to pass away. But the people who are now raising children and grandchildren who bought into his ideology, and like the Christians who went from, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him, to being full on advocates with jackets and billboards and hats and t-shirts. Those people are showing another generation of people like what it means to be Christian. And what's happening now is, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is younger people are either going, that's bullshit and I want nothing to do with it, or they're going, oh, this is what Christianity is. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. If you look at a fundamental outlook of something like Christianity, there's only one outcome, is that you read the Bible to find the right answer. And then we find the right answer in a document that's written between 3,500 to 2,000 years ago. And there we find the right answer. Now, the problem with that is it was written at best a couple of thousand years ago. Maybe at best it was updated, a few hundred years after that, here and there or whatever. But generally speaking, we're looking at a document that's 2,000 years old. And that's our description of what's ideal. Now, we all know some really screwed up stuff was going on back then that still falls into ideal, right? We faced this with slavery. Right? And we had people fighting for slavery using the Bible. We also had people fighting against slavery using the Bible as well. So, there's different approaches. But when you've got a fundamental approach, the perfect description is in the Bible. It's back there. And then what we have is then any movement beyond that is evil. It's against the word of God, the desire of God, the heartbeat of God, the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is back there. And then what you have is someone comes along and goes, hey, I'm going to make America great again. Anyone that comes along and says, hey, remember the good old days? I'll drag us backwards. That becomes the rallying cry for a fundamental Christian. Whereas someone that goes, hey, I think we can do this better. I think we can be more loving. I think we can be more inclusive. Hey, I want to see a better world for my grandkids. That's actually scary to a fundamental because it means we're going to have to change. We're going to have to embrace ideas that we don't want to embrace. And it feels like an impasse. Do you see a hope for kind of like more fundamental expressions of Christianity when you look at it? Or do you think it's just a loss? It's gone.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I really don't know. I hesitate to say that it's a loss because I have a very, the way the West practices religion is a part of it, but it's not the whole. There's there are people who practice faith all over the world in some very genuine ways, that for all I know could be the majority of people who practice faith. Now it's a very American thing to think that America's the whole world, right? That like we're number one, and what's ironic, if you like Google a lot of things, America's not number one in a lot that we're number one in very few things. And most of those things are not things
they're bad usually.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we have this view over here that like our way of practicing faith, our democracy, our currency, our sports, everything is we're the best in the world. And so I hesitate to really speak for global Christianity because I believe that ultimately, because I believe in God, because I believe in the though that means a lot, means it's a very different meaning than it used to mean to me when I say that. But because of that belief that all of this is headed somewhere good, I choose to believe that, yes, everything can be redeemed and that everything, every person is redeemable. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't know what that looks like, but I choose to believe that, I think that love, that compassion, that grace, that these things that we like all want more of, we all ultimately will have an abundance of that. And so, I mean, and I think any person that does work in like what you're doing, Phil, with deconstruction, and putting out content around that and taking time to podcast and write and blog and teach on these things. I think everyone doing that, I don't know a person doing that who's doing it for the money. You know what I'm saying?
God, I'm definitely not doing it for the money.
So there is something in all of us that are doing this that's saying, hey, it's
the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. We can move in a better direction than where things have been going. Yeah. And I think that thing, right, that has all of us saying the same things. We've never seen each other until today.
Yeah.
But our work is very similar, which leads me to believe there's something out there in the universe drawing us somewhere. Yeah. And I think that place is good.
Yeah. Do you have an indication? So one of the things that fascinates me about deconstruction is we're doing research on deconstruction. I think it's really important to be doing because it's a really unknown kind of group of people and it's often lumped in with a whole bunch of people, but it's very varied. What we're finding is you can be a deconstructing Christian and you can be an atheist, you can be agnostic, you could be still Christian, you can be progressive Christian, you can still be tiptoeing within quite a bit of fundamental Christianity, you could be moving into Buddhism or, you can be almost anything and be a deconstructing Christian. But do you yourself, it sounds like you feel like we're heading somewhere. What do you think are the commonalities of what do you, I guess you mentioned you believe in God, so you believe there's something that's maybe drawing us forwards, but what is that drawing us forwards to? Like what is the commonality that you see?
The only commonality I see, and I heard it as you just described it just now, and it was a beautiful description, and I love it. I love that description that everyone's there, right? It's more space is the best way I can describe where I think it's headed. And to be honest, I think it's already there, but I think it's just ever expanding like the universe. Like it's just more space that more people can find themselves belonging. And that even in that belonging, there's not this universal sense of we all think and believe the same things, like line by line, all the way from top to bottom in order to be a part of this club. It's that, like you said, I'm a Buddhist, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I am a evangelical. Well, I don't know about evangelical, but I'm a Christian.
There's a few in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like you can belong here, right? And the only thing, and if I were, which I thank God I'm not and never should be, if I were like the grand czar of the deconstructionist space, I would say that the only thing that disqualifies you from this space is if you decide that you have to impose your shit on everyone else.
Yeah.
Because that is fundamentally not what this is about. I love how Richard Rohr talks about Christianity and how Christianity is at its best should be adding to all of the world religions, not competing with them. Not trying to prove that we have the market cornered on ultimate goodness. And that I grew up in that. I grew up in so much of this have to prove. And I remember in one of these Christian schools I was a part of, I think it's my senior year, there's this Bible class. It was all about defending your faith against whatever. And this whole apologetics movement, which I can't, I hate apologetics because it is a way for like people who aren't scholarly to have this like real, like, you know, this badge of I'm smart about Christian stuff, even though you're dumb as shit about it. Like it's just, so this apologetics kind of thing.
Perfectly worded why I hate it as well.
But like, so, and I think like, you know, that whole thing, as I said before, I don't think it's what the faith was about. I don't think Jesus was walking the earth trying to defend Christianity against anything. You know, it wasn't like, I don't see that from Jesus. I still don't see that. I do see a little bit more of that from Paul, which is an interesting conversation I get into with a Nazarene pastor friend of mine who I have a great deal of respect for. Every now and again, I'll text him and say, dude, Paul and Jesus are really different. You know, they're just very different in how they approach things, which would make sense. Paul's in a Greek world and he's dealing with Greek people and they're very logical and they debate things and they're orators and they're, you know, we lose in the writings of Paul and the authors of the New Testament, we lose the Old Testament story and meaning, right? Yeah. And even in Jesus' parables, Jesus' parables are like, they're like these movies that just end. And you're like, well,
right.
Wait,
there's no kind of nice conclusion.
You're like, what do you mean? What happens? What happens to the prodigal son? What happens to the older brother? Like what? Like you're like, what happens or what? And I think that's the point, is that they're left with this, as I described it, space. This space, and I think this is all at more and more space, more and more people being able to say, yes, me too. Yeah. I feel that way sometimes. I understand that grief. I have that question, or I have that experience. I feel that pain. Like that to me is hopefully where all this is headed. And ultimately, again, a space where we as human beings are taking care of people who need to be taken care of. That we're not demonizing people for being poor. We're not demonizing people for, it's like here in the United States, we have this long history of anti-Blackness, right? That like we had slavery, we had Jim Crow. We now are living in an era of police violence and police brutality towards Black and brown folks. And so you bury Black and brown folks underneath all of that. There's redlining where like Black folks, up until I think recently, there were still neighborhoods in the United States where Black people could not buy property, right? I was sitting on the back porch about 3 years ago with 4 or 5 older Black people who in the 70s, right? In the 70s were going to a segregated school, I think in Tennessee, right? I was born in 78. I'm only 42 years old. We're not talking about ancient history. So we've got Black folks buried underneath all of this stuff. And then we turn around and demonize them for crime, for violence, for rioting. What the hell do you think you would do? What kind of choices do you feel that you would make if your only choices are starve, die, or do some crime so you can have some money and live? And any one of us would do that. Not to mention the fact that we have this real like glorification of crime, as long as it's like European crime, like Ocean's 11. Right? And the gangster movies, right? Those things we are like, we're like, oh yeah, that's awesome. Oh, look how smart they are. But in real time, if Black people make like decisions that again, are they poor decisions from our perch? Yes. But are they poor decisions when you've got option A, B, and C, and every one of those options is shitty? We don't see that people made the best shitty decision that they had because we have the privilege of having better options. And we're like, you know, so I see a world, hopefully, where we stop penalizing people for being Black, for being poor, you know, for being other in whatever way that our society has marginalized them. And then we turn around and act like it's their fault that they're in the margins.
Yeah. This is so huge. I mean, when I lived in America, I lived in Northern California, and it was like the whitest of white places I've ever been. And I'm from the UK, and we've got quite a bit of diversity, but I'm Scottish, so there's not too much diversity once you cross the border. I think about 5% of Scotland is not white. So it's pretty low. And what's funny is it's one of the most inclusive areas in the UK. So go figure. Yeah, I don't know. But going to, I mean, I knew one black guy. I actually lived with him. And it was my first kind of introduction to someone that was black and American, and they were so different to someone that I knew that was black from the UK. And I was like, gosh, a lot of these stereotypes I've been given about a black American, that's a real culture. That actually is a thing, like that's going on there. And then just seeing that this person was utterly alone, it was him. And we were a school of like 1,000 people. There was a church of about 3,000 people. It was a town of about 100,000 people. And I think there was maybe like 5 black people in this town. You know what I mean? It was just, there was no one. And I was just like, I cannot comprehend. I mean, I felt the odd one out being the only Scottish guy there. You know what I mean? But you know what? I got by okay as a Scot in white middle class America. And I was constantly thinking about that with him. I don't think I had the intellectual capacity and the anti-racial awareness to ever really have those conversations with him. I wish I had at the time, and I'm sure he would have probably appreciated that. But I do remember at the time thinking, gosh, I feel so out of the loop here. Like a lot of the time when I was in America, I'm like, this place is bloody insane. This place is weird. This place is really anti a lot of things that I'm like, I don't think that's wrong, or, you know, whatever. And I felt really like I couldn't speak up all the time. So I was there during the 2008 and 2012 elections. And they were very much like, the only Christian vote is this vote. And guess what? It wasn't for the black guy. And I was like, this is weird. Surprise. You're saying that the Mormon is a Christian, not the guy that goes to church every Sunday. Like a week ago, before you found out this guy was running, you would have said Mormons are cults. Right? You would have said it was a cult. And 100%. I'm just like, this seems weird. But the point, I guess, being like, I cannot even comprehend the whole other level it is to come from what is like a huge subculture. And I guess it's something I've thought about a lot when it comes to deconstruction, because deconstruction, is remarkably a white space. Like hugely, it's a white space. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but certainly from my perspective, and we all gravitate to bubbles, and maybe I attract more white people, and they recommend more white people, and there's more white leaders that I'm talking to, or you know, that's natural, and I think in some ways inescapable unless we're intentionally anti-racist and really pushing for different voices to be in the mix and influencing us. But I frequently say, guys, who are the black, you know, indigenous people of color that are in the deconstruction space? I've got lots of people that are black and indigenous and brown or whatever that I'm following that speak to me about race, that speak to me about a whole bunch of different things. But there's very few that are talking about deconstruction. Yeah. And it just doesn't seem to be going on. What do you think are some of the components going on there? There seems to be a lot going on. And I've got different ideas, but I'd love to hear what you think as far as why that is.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I don't think I'd even thought about that before. What comes to front of mind, just as, again, this is all just my opinion. I haven't even done a lot of deep thinking about this. But if you think about the civil rights movement, there were religious people at the forefront of it. You know, here in the United States with Dr. King and Malcolm X, and I mean, you've got Ida B. Wells and Ella Baker and Rosa Parks, and these folks were all faith-based people. Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, Minister Farrakhan. Like, even you think about today with Linda Sarsour, Ben and Michael McBride, Sean King was a pastor. So you've got these people that have this faith base that move more into the social. I shouldn't say move into, because the faith should be right progressing socially. Overlap. It's not different, right? But I think that what is probably true is a couple of things. One, Black folks don't have time to name it deconstruction because they're fighting for their lives. Number two, the Black church has always been so actively involved in social issues from race to gun violence to, because even in our own communities, there has been anti-gang violence and anti-gun violence, and in our own sort of, not war on drugs, but our own training and teaching and sitting with people about staying away from drugs in our community because of how harmful they are. So that there's within the Black community its own things happening where I think a lot of people arrived at deconstruction and decolonization at the same time. And where Black folks didn't have to decolonize, because the Black church is already, as we talked about earlier, the AME church is very different than the white evangelical schools I was going to. I just didn't appreciate it as a kid. But the AME church is already out there in the forefront of justice and taking care of the poor and the widow, because it's what's right outside the front door of Black churches in America. I have a friend of mine, Michael McBride, who's been on my podcast, whose his church is in the middle of Berkeley, downtown Berkeley. Whenever there is some sort of gun violence or something that happens, a lot of times those people go to his church. So it's not like the white evangelical suburban church that has to drive 40 minutes to the scene of the crime. You are pastoring in a community where the crime has happened. It's outside your front door. So people in the community know you. You're already there. So again, you don't have the time to sit and think philosophically about deconstruction, because you've got people who you got a mom whose 8-year-old was hit by a stray bullet, right? Who you have to care for now. So I think it's just a different deal. And so I think, and again, also the point I really want to drive home is that you're not decolonizing. Yeah. Like you already know the power of the Black church. You already know what the Black church has meant to communities and what it continues to mean and what it continues to offer, and how many of my family members they buried, how many of my family members the Black church married. So it's like you have this attachment to the Black church because of what it has done for you at an existential level, not what it has taught you necessarily. It's not just like, oh, I learned about Jesus there. It's that they were there for me when I needed it. Gospel music, as an example. I was randomly listening to gospel music yesterday. I very rarely listen to any Christian music anymore, but like I just had this like hankering for gospel music to start listening to Fred Hammond. And these songs, I'm listening to, his discography, all of these songs, and every one of them comes out of struggle. Every one of them is this contrast between a shitty experience with a divine justice and goodness and provision and wholeness and peace that's already existing. They weren't necessarily songs about like defending our faith. They were songs about God being a fence, a shelter, a strong tower, all of those things, where I don't know that for a lot of white folks in church, that's been the case. I remember when I first started leading worship at like this, fairly large white church, and I brought with me this whole like, God's going to help you financially, right? God's going to help you with your bills. God's going to help you with getting out of debt, all those things, right? That like, depending on your perch, again, some of that could be prosperity or some of that could just simply be hope that like, when your baby need a new pair of shoes, that God's going to help you. So I remember going into white spaces and I remember feeling such a reluctance to go there, because I'm like, I don't need to hear that. Like, I don't need to hear that God is a provider necessarily. I mean, I'm not to say that every white person has all their needs met. Of course, every human being has needs. But by and large, if you look at it at a macro level and you go, what is it that a white person from the suburbs who comes to church, like, what is the desperate need that they have for God, right? And so I think that for me, a lot of Black folks' desperate need for God that they found in church. They would cling to it because they needed it. Yeah. And a lot of white folks weren't necessarily clinging to their Christian faith because their life was all right. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So like, so they're then it's probably a little bit easier for them to go, let me deconstruct from this because I don't need it. Yeah. It's part of my life. It doesn't
cost as much.
No, exactly.
I have wondered as well, and it's intriguing to me that, of course, you are a Black person that was heavily within a white world, as far as your faith goes, certainly. And that intrigues me because I do often wonder, looking from the outside and looking at data. I'm a very data-driven person. I do research. So I love the data, and there's no question that Black America is Christian. It is like Christian landscape, right? Compared to white America is very Christian as well, but the data gap between those two statements is big. If you're Black in America, you're Christian almost without question. If you're white, probably, yeah, maybe, yeah. Or you might say you're Christian, but how often do you go to church? But it just feels that to be Black in America is to be a part of a community that overlaps with church. And overlaps with Christianity, in that there is a community that is driven, that is, we are in this together. We're here. We are, you pick up the Bible and you read about the oppressed. We are the oppressed, right? The white people have to go, look at that person. He wants to take away my rights to sell this thing. Exactly. I'm the oppressed in the Bible. Whereas Black people are going, no, I'm literally, I was a slave a few generations back. It's not hard. And so I do wonder if the conflation between what it is to be Black and being a Christian is such a tight interwoven thing. Do you have thoughts on that? And if that is problematic potentially? I'm not trying to critique that, but just saying if there are people that want to deconstruct, maybe people that are going, I'm not sure about my faith, but that doesn't feel like as free an option that like you're saying, a white person has the privilege of going, if I don't fit in my church anymore, it's not a big deal. But Black person doesn't fit in their church, in the local community anymore. That could be, from my perspective looking in, it could be a very different scenario as far as what it costs.
For sure.
Is that fair, or do you think
I think it is fair.
What's going on?
I think there's so much to it, right? I think that you kind of touched on it when you talk about the Christian faith has always been a bottom up sort of message when it comes to the hierarchy. You think about like the mythology of the birth of Christ, where we're in the Christmas season, right? That whole mythology is a shepherds who were the shittiest people in the social construct of that day. You didn't get lower than shepherds. Shepherds find out first, before kings, before priests, before before farmers, before tax collectors, before any important people find out. In the mythology of Jesus, this story, this narrative that Luke and Matthew give us about the birth of Christ, right? They are specifically saying that this is not going to be like the other stories that you've heard, where in a castle somewhere or in this, this regal setting that this savior of the world was born. Like, the stories you heard about Caesar, this is a different story. This starts with poor people. So I think that like that truth, that reality, when you think about Black people in the United States, that type of story would resonate, right? That type of that, and the slave owners knew that too, because as we've seen over I think it was, 2-3 years ago, came to light that that slave owners removed Exodus from the Bible that they taught the slaves. Why? Because the Exodus story is a story of liberation.
Right.
You don't want your property getting any ideas that God would rescue them. So that's removed. Anything about liberation is removed from their Bible, so they can't read that. Because, so again, speaking to the power of what the Bible communicates to a group of people who have been enslaved, who have been oppressed, who have been pushed to the margins. So naturally in the United States, Black folks will go, yeah, I resonate with a story like that. Oh, 400 years of slavery? Yeah, that's our story. Like, so I think there's that component that's like, there's something to all of this that I can get down with for Black folks that makes it a little bit, harder for Black folks to go, I got to deconstruct some things. But also I think that, there are more and more Black folks though, that I see all the time that are going, I don't know why y'all believe in that Christian stuff, because that's a white man's religion. I have a good friend who calls his experience being a part of a denomination that him and I both were part of as a white supremacist death cult, right? So people are like coming out of that going, yeah, that was bullshit. It's just I just don't think Black folks are as noisy about it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting you bring that up, because I hadn't thought about Black folks and deconstruction. It's just kind of something, I've just kind of been in, because it's been interesting to me. It's been my journey. I know black folks who have done it and just were just like, yeah, I did it, whatever.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
we got bigger
Wow.
fish to fry.
Yeah, no, and that's it. I mean, I talk as fairly often the level of privilege in being able to deconstruct, right? I mean, like just having the time. I mean, I have the level of privilege where I do this full time as well. It's my job to deconstruct, right? People are like, oh, like how come like you figured this bit out much quicker? And it's like, because I do it like 12 hours a day,
Exactly.
right? How many hours are you doing this? Like you've got kids and a wife and a job and whatever. Like you throw into other mixes of like, geez, you've got like gunfire keeping you up all night. You're being, systemically oppressed. You're not, you don't have the access to the same education. There's so many layers and layers in which, privilege is just stripped away. Deconstruction is a very privileged process. That really intrigues me what you talk about with, you talked about, the concept that, and it's true that Christianity is the white man's religion in a sense, right? I mean, the black people in America that are Christian because white people dragged them out of their beds somewhere else and brought them to America and gave them that religion. Do you have thoughts on, how do we navigate that? Because it helps a lot of people, right? There's no getting around the fact that that's true. And yet at the same time, wow, that's kind of fucked up, right? It's like, what's going on there? Like that's a head trip. That is a head trip.
It is, bro. And Rob Bell's latest book, Everything is Spiritual, has been a really good read for me. And one of the things that he highlights in that book that I think is amazing is he goes down this whole rabbit hole of physics. What's that? There's this term for some physics, like
like quantum physics kind of stuff.
Quantum physics. Yes, he goes on this whole rabbit hole of quantum physics and starts talking about particles and atoms and everything belonging and being in space together, right? But this one line he uses is that everything is a part of the whole, right? It's a part. This awful experience is part, and this great experience is part, and these people you've broken away from are part, and you are part, right? So it's all parts of the story. And so as I look at, chattel slavery and the antebellum South and the Jim Crow era, it's a part of a greater story. It's a shitty ass part that we're still living out of. And inside of that, you find something divine happening in the resolve of Black people. Like you find this, like this strength to continue to go on. You find this like something divine happening. I believe a divine energy is in Black women and in their resiliency, and the fact that they keep getting up, and the fact that they keep writing and championing and carrying us, even most recently in the elections, that Black women came out and said, "We got you again." Right? Something divine that continues to happen, that I think is the redeeming part of God, because I really don't give a shit anymore about what, book or tradition or, practices you have that like teach you about the nature of the Creator. The fact is that there is something, like, whatever you name that thing, you can name it a person, you name it a thing. There is something that gave life to you and I. Like there's something that did that. If you think it's random, if you think it's whatever, there's still something, right, that did that. And so to me, that's the redeeming part of it that allows me to be able to look back at some of the African religion that I don't even know about, some of the African deity, some of the African ideas about spirituality that were stripped from people who live in America. So much so that there were Black people who were basically literally demonizing Beyonce, because Beyonce in her most recent, short film was like dressed as some of the African.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And people were like, "Oh, that's demonic," and yada, yada, yada. And again, because here in the United States, we don't even have a connection, many of us, to how sacred that was to our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get to have that. We don't get to lean into that. We don't get to buy that. We are told that is demonic, that is anti-Christ before we even get to discover it for ourselves. So there's the tension to me, is that like with Christianity, there's like, don't believe, read, think about anything else but these handful of things we gave you. All of that and all the stuff your ancestors practiced was savage and wrong and evil and demonic and whatever. Just stay away from it. While also having that in the teachings of Jesus, even some of the really fucked up ones that we got from white evangelicals, there's some, radical truth there. Yeah. There is, I think, as there always has been, I think we find God at work in great things, and we find God at work in things that are not so great. And that to me, again, is all a part of this thing headed somewhere good, and it doesn't always make sense. And there's some awful turmoil. I mean, there right now, sitting outside my house for the last week, it's the strangest thing. And at some point I may develop the courage to go out there and see what's happening. But there's a man who's sitting on the bench across the street. There's like a park across the street from my house. It used to be a golf course. And he's just been sitting there, sitting there. And I've actually, it's so much so that I feel it's made me like have this philosophical thought. How long can I sit in one place and do nothing, just sitting? Yeah. Right. And I'm like, this is a person, my brother in life, who has some story that caused him to sit on the bench outside of my house. And I have a story that has me in the warmth. Sometimes my house is too hot. I have too much food in my refrigerator right now. Like, and I feel that, right? And I go, it's terrible what's happened to him, I believe, anyway, based on what I'm seeing. But I also thank God every day for what I have. Yeah. Both things are divine. And I don't understand it. And I think it's shitty, to be honest, but both things are somehow divine. And I love the fact that there's so much mystery in the deconstruction space. And the way I think about God now, that I can shrug my shoulders a lot and go, I don't know, but I believe something is at work here, and I don't have to control it. I just get to follow it.
Yeah. It's an amazing space to come to where we can kind of just go, I don't know, but I'll probably just get a bit closer to figuring it out at some point. I don't know. Again, maybe that's a level of privilege on some of it. These are kind of topics that maybe are like, either so out there it doesn't matter, right? We spend time thinking about things that who even knows and who cares, or we're thinking about things that we're on the lucky side, right? So I'm thinking about, why do some people go hungry and other people have too much? Because I have too much in my fridge right now. But I've also thought about that when I've had very little in the fridge, and it was less of a, I wonder, I guess I'll figure out one day. It was well, maybe there'll be what if I die between now and then of hunger, There's this very real kind of like breadline stuff. But even just on an existential level, on an internal feeling okay in the world and feeling grounded to your being able to shrug off stuff and go, I don't know. That's a psychological state that people arrive at if they're lucky. It feels like most people aren't in a place where they can shrug off. Most people need a bit of a black and white answer to these questions in life. Have you always been a bit like, who knows? Or have you kind of done that shift from being a bit more black and white to kind of not knowing? And how did you navigate going from one to the other? Because what I found is a lot of people, they lose their black and white. So they've got black and white and this is the right answer, and they lose that answer. They go, it doesn't make sense anymore. But what do I believe now? Right? So they still want a black and white world, but they don't have that option. And it's only over time they kind of get to that place. Like, how did you kind of navigate all that? Like,
I mean, I think some of it was by accident, I think some of it was just sort of, you stumble into it. I think I was definitely very black and white through my teenage years, which is interesting too, right? Because I say this often, deconstruction is its most fun when it's just you, but when you've got wife and kids, especially teenagers, deconstruction is less fun. Like we can rail on purity culture all day until you got daughters.
Right.
Talk about sex with them. Right. So I think this recently I've been thinking a lot about stages and seasons. And I told my brother yesterday, I said, we needed a youth group as teenagers because teenagers' brains are a scrambled mess, right? They especially, I've got an 18-year-old. She is learning 19. She just turned 19 yesterday. She is learning how to be grown, but she doesn't know how to be. She has autonomy and she lives at home and she's figuring out what she wants to do, but she's like, I think she's an Enneagram 7, which is why I can't get her to take the damn test because I think that's just, but like she's adventurous. I want to explore. I want to do this. I want to do that and the other. And I don't necessarily think about the future. The future will be here when it gets here. And I think there's a season where grounding is important while you're like developing in this sort of stage of like, you're about to leave the nest and become an adult. And I think that there are these, Apostle Paul kind of talks about this briefly, like where you had like these teachers that would teach you, which he describes as the Torah, as almost like this training wheel thing, right? That like you need before you start writing. And so I think that like, I don't know, Phil, if it's a black and white season that's important, but I do think there's a season where you need something to deconstruct from.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. I agree. And so I'm like, it serves a purpose. It has a, some benefit. And that's how I'm navigating it now, because I'm now watching my children, at the stage where I was going to youth group every week. I wasn't even listening to any music that wasn't Christian. I wasn't watching rated R movies. I wasn't doing drugs. I wasn't drinking. I was doing none of those things. I believed that the moment I did anything wrong, Jesus was going to come back and the rapture would happen. Right. That's what
right.
I grew up, right?
Sitting on your own.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be here and have to fight the mark of the beast and all this other bullshit. Like I thought that right growing up. So, I look back and say, yeah, I don't want my kids believing that kind of trash, but I do want something for them that's like grounding and centering and gives them a moral compass. I myself, before my kids got older, it was all fun and games. It was beautiful. And I loved every minute of it. I remember being in church even, then I still worked at a church when I first started deconstructing and all the songs were different. They like were more beautiful somehow. Some of them, not all of them, because some of them turned out to be like, I can't believe I ever sung this, but some of them were really beautiful where you're like, oh yeah, that feels big. That feels mysterious. That feels a little bit dangerous. That doesn't feel like, God, the Jesus is my homeboy type stuff, that it feels like it does justice to the enormity of the concept of God that, and I've said, I believe everyone believes something about God, that, whether they believe that God is, all knowing, all powerful with us, expressed through Jesus, or, in light and, and we're all part of God, or they don't believe there's a God. Everyone believes something, which, to me, I think is this, it still keeps us all in some ways tethered to the idea and to the concept of God. And that to me is what I've still to this moment find to be very, very beautiful, because if the Jesus, the God that I had black and white certainty about, that's a boring ass eternity. If there is an eternity, if I've got an eternity to like be in whatever state there is after this, that's boring as hell to think like, oh yeah, there's 66 books that told me everything I need to know. What's next? You know what I mean? So I think this space where I don't even know if there's an afterlife is scary and awesome and like mysterious and big and beautiful. And I think I like this better.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I was actually just recording a prior podcast, and we were talking about suffering and pain, and the person basically just said, like, well, like, the thing is, if we get rid of all that stuff, right? I mean, what is life as well? Like, it sounds nice for a while, like it really does, but after a while, it's like, oh, so what are we gonna build and overcome, and like, you know, and how do we even frame good if there's no bad, or like, you know, pleasure if there's no pain, or, you know, it does feel like to be this, you know, double-edged sword to the whole thing. Yeah. Have you ever studied like spiral dynamics or a human psychological development model or anything? Because that's really what you're touching on, it feels like.
I have a little bit, like a very little bit. In fact, I had Mike McCard, aka Science Mike, on the podcast not too long ago, and I specifically asked him about spiral dynamics, because I think there was an episode of The Liturgist that I was fascinated by, that he was talking about it.
One on that.
Yeah. So I very little, but I do love the idea of it, right? I do love like the idea of an evolving human consciousness, and that it's not, you know, what I love about spiral dynamics is that it's not like it's levels, and they're very specific to saying it's not levels.
Yeah, it's not.
It's just space. It's just movement, you know.
It's just expanding.
And you just I can't look at someone who's, you know, red and say you're stupid because I'm turquoise. Yeah, it's like you just
right in there.
Just like, it's just
a bit more as well.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think to me, that's what I love about it is the evolving human consciousness, that we're consistently evolving. And I think even that term evolving, people, you know, the fundamentalists have such a hard time with the notion of evolving, because evolving is scary, because we're going to go out there to somewhere different than where we are now. And this is again why white folks have the hardest time with this, or anybody at the top of the caste system has a hard time with going on to the next thing, because in the next round, I might not be on top.
Yeah.
In the next, it's projected that in the United States by the year 2040, white folks will be the minority for the first time in the history of the United States. Yeah. And a lot of them are scared to death. That's what Donald Trump was. That's what a wall to keep Mexicans out of the United States was. That's what that's like this. We have to stop this progression, because in the next season, we may not be on top the way we are now. So anybody who's benefiting from the current season looks at the next one and goes, wait a minute, this is woven into the mythology of the Christmas story, is that Caesar sees the threat of another king who's Jewish. Like, we gotta stomp this out before we gotta kill this before it ever becomes something that shifts the power dynamic. Man, that's what makes life so beautiful. And we even talked about it a few minutes ago, and none of us love the season where we're not on top. None of us love the hungry season. We don't love the empty fridge season. We do love the full fridge, but we don't love the empty fridge season. And I think that's another thing that Paul said. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that I think Paul and Jesus are different. I don't hate Paul. I just think they're different. Like Paul talks about learning the secret to life is being content with whatever state I'm in. Recognizing that there are going to be different stages that I'm in. There's going to be a time that I'm hungry, and there's going to be a time that I'm full. There's going to be a time that I have more than enough and not enough. And how do I learn to live with the same level of peace throughout all of that?
It's interesting, you know, we talk about no one wants to be in the stage of suffering, no one wants to be in the stage of hunger. And yet there is a component that once we get through those things, you know, the death of a loved one, maybe a illness or whatever, there's a component where we can look back on that and go, gosh, I so value that season that shaped me, it formed me, I learned this and that, I grew so much closer to this person because of that. Or it's fascinating that, Ram Dass talks about it as a fierce grace. And he says, he talks about his own stroke, and he says, I would not wish the stroke on anyone, but I wish the grace that came from the stroke on everyone. And that's it, right? I look at the season of my mum passing, and I go, God, I don't want anyone's mom to die. God, no one should ever lose anyone. Let's just take that off the table. And yeah, I really hope every person can learn some of the lessons I learned through that. So much I wish that people could learn those lessons. It's a really, when you look at your life in these kind of like stages or seasons and things, and you start to realize, gosh, who would I be without these moments? It's very hard. And maybe it's a bit of privilege because we've got the space to look back on a hard time. Maybe we'd be thinking differently if we always were hungry, right? If we never had a full fridge at any point.
If you never,
I don't know, like, right? I mean, that's a whole nother kind of level. But I guess the reason I brought up Sarah Dance is the concept of you need, and Richard Rohr talks about this in the 2 stages of life, right? The first stage of life, you build your structure, your ideas, what is life and who am I and all this. Mm-hmm. And in the second stage, you go, oh, it's all crap. It's all falling apart, and you start to refigure out everything you do. And I think you're right. I think, when you look at someone like a teenager, they're in a stage of life where they're straddling the second stage of maybe stepping into some autonomy, but generally speaking, they still want some structure. They want some rights and wrongs, some yes and no, some black and white, some they want to know, how do I fit in this world and what works? And often they need someone to kind of give them some of that. And it intrigues me as to how we go about that as we deconstruct. I mean, your kids presumably grew up in the Christian world.
Yep.
And then they have watched you. I don't know whether you were very open with your kids about that process, or maybe you weren't initially and then became more. But how have you navigated having children and helping them deal with your deconstruction while trying to give them some structure and, life and certainty and...
So that combined with COVID-19 has just been a very interesting dynamic because, we were going to church. We'd go to Black church together because they love Black church. I mean, we spent, since they were born, we were part of predominantly white churches, after, I was working at a large white church here in the Bay Area. And, we parted ways, not in a great way. It wasn't like, we parted ways. It was like, oh, it was great. And it's very rarely with church breakups that it's like great. There's normally some story that's pretty shitty. So, they started to gravitate towards Black church. It felt home for all of us. Well, part of Black church, and I'm curious too, to think about how Black churches are doing like this whole online church thing, because Black church is very experiential. It's very, you're there in the space, you're shaking hands. It's a reason why the schedule is loose, whereas a lot of white evangelicals would describe Black church as unorganized. I would say that it's a very casual atmosphere. It's like, the reason we don't start right at 9 is because people are fellowshipping at 9. Yeah. Church doesn't start with the first note being played. It starts with you arriving there, seeing people that and you're touching them, you're hugging, you're finding out how their Thanksgiving was. You're all of those things. You're talking about your kids. Yeah. Then some point at 9:05, 9:10, someone starts playing an instrument and church begins. And that's been demonized by white church because like, oh, that's backwards. No, that is God. That is the fellowship, right? So we don't have that anymore. So my kids watching me with deconstruction and part of how they start to watch it, I wasn't like walking around going, kids, I'm deconstructing. Right. It was just like
just running through high school.
when things came up and they had questions, the answers were different.
Right.
The sex conversation when I was a fundamentalist, pretty much white evangelical, when they were 5 years old, was don't be gay. That's the conversation. I didn't say that to them, but I said, hey guys, I want you to know that that about sex. Sex is for, married moms and dads. That's what I taught them when they were 5. Now here we are years later and I'm going, yeah, that was bullshit, guys. I'm sorry. I told you that. So it's just like different, it's not again that I'm saying that I'm deconstructing. It's just that life happens and your answers to life things are different than they were when they were younger. Yeah. And some of the big things like, Dad, do you think when we go to heaven that we blah, blah, blah? And we'll go, actually, I'm not sure we go to heaven. and then that's a whole other conversation, right? So I think,
yeah.
so I think it's just like, I think it's that. But I'm finding, the other day, I was praying and meditating while I was getting ready. I don't know what it means for God to speak in the same way that I used to have this certainty that this voice you hear in your head is the voice of the Holy Spirit. But it was whatever this thought, idea, voice gave me a certain level of peace. And that voice was, I know how to name myself to your kids, right? This is what I felt. I felt this overwhelming sense of like, oh, okay, like I don't have to worry about them, though I'm out here deconstructing. Like if I were dragging them to Sunday school every week versus now, ultimately the thing that has to happen is that the divine has to introduce themselves to my children. That's what happened to Abraham. In the stories that we read, that's what happens with all these people who encounter the Creator. It's like, the Creator shows up and and introduces themselves. But what's actually beautiful about having Black daughters is the one time that the Creator gets a name from a human being is Hagar, who's a Black woman. The one time in all of Scripture that the Creator gets named by the person that they encounter is with this Black woman. So I'm like, okay, you know how to find your way to people regardless of where they're at. So whatever needs to happen that's good and full and life-giving for my children as they grow up, I just now trust that God can do that. I don't have to.
That's a beautiful place to arrive for sure. Like, I mean, yeah, I can imagine a lot of people listening going, oh, this is nice. I want that for me, never mind for our kids, It sounds beautiful, have you felt in that process a need to shelter your kids from the uncertainty? You mentioned your kids like, I'm not sure we go to heaven. Like that could be a really unsettling thought. I mean, that's an unsettling thought for any human, but like as a young kid, I don't know. I remember as a kid, there was a few things holding me together at times other than, at least I get to go to heaven at some point because this thing's a shit show. And so do you, I mean, even I think of my dad, I think of this unchanging rock. Now he's changed a lot in the more recent years, but as a kid, certainly my perception was like, Dad knows everything. He's just like this machine. It doesn't even show emotion almost, maybe apart from anger occasionally. He's just like, he's in his zone. He does his thing. He's on it. He didn't even cry when my mum was like, she was very ill when we were younger and he might have died. And he just a wall and he'd go away and cry. I mean, he tells us now, that's it. But he'd come back and he's straight faced for the kids. And then for the thought of my dad to be like uncertain and not sure and going through a lot of that, I think as a kid that might have I don't know if it would have been a good thing. It might have been a really nice and healthy thing actually in some ways. But in other ways, I think it would have kind of shaken me. How have your kids responded to having a dad who's gone from, right, guys, this is it. Just don't be gay. Don't, sleep with anyone before marriage. The earth is made this long ago. I don't know. You probably never brought into that one. But to suddenly I'm not so sure, kids. You're going to have to figure this out.
I think they've, it's a great question. I probably should ask them. What I'm observing from them is, that they're the same kids that they've always been, believing a lot of the same things, especially my youngest one. She actually just mentioned going to heaven 2 days ago. And I didn't stop her and say, hey, it's just it's funny when you think about heaven and hell and the fundamentalist way of that's the ultimate scoreboard of how your life went, right? Is that, you have so many points and if you have enough, you get to go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell and you suffer forever. So think about that you forever. Okay. So your lifespan is proportionate to eternity, the same way that a golf ball is proportionate to the earth, right? That's the lifespan of, that we have. So for that lifespan to go south in any way means that you spend the rest of eternity somehow burning.
Right.
To me, we are doomed. That's too narrow.
Rigged game. Yeah.
We're all fucked if that's how this works. So I have to, at this point I'm like, if it depends on me, like right now, how I think and how I believe, I didn't ask for it. I didn't wake up one day and go, I want to deconstruct today. I didn't wake up one day and go, I want to believe something different. I want to like discover something different. I want to feel drawn to something different. I didn't ask for that. So for me to be where I'm at, and if where I'm at then is somehow anti-Christ in such a way that I am doomed to an eternity of burning torment, that's really cruel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when I think about my kids from that vantage point, I go, what I want for them is for them to grow up with a sense of dignity that they have in themselves, right? That they believe that they do carry the image of God, however that man, even if they don't name it that, but that they carry themselves in such a way that their life has meaning and purpose, and that they are living in this ever-expanding universe, making space for people is the way they are now. Mm. This generation is making space for everyone. We didn't even tell them to do that. They're just doing it, right? Yeah. So that they're doing that, that they are, that they're finding joy in their life. To me, that they are participating in what I believe to be the advancement of the way God wants the world to be arranged, that they're participating in that. I think every one of them is going to in some way do that. Like, I feel okay with that. I don't know what all you're going to believe. I don't know what more we'll discover, right. 10 years from now when my kids are like full ass adults. I don't know what will have been discovered. Will I be here? Will our mom be here? Who won't, it's like life will have happened, and lots of stuff that has not happened will shape how my children, then my grown ass adult, offspring will see the world and affect the world. I hate when I do this, but it just popped in my mind. So it is what it is. I never wanted to be the douchey golf dude who always made like golf analogies for like life application. But like, I can't help it. I love golf. It's in my bones now. And nice. I love playing it. So like, I was really bad at it. So I got an instructor to help me learn how to swing a golf club. And one of the lessons, I'll never forget it because I try to remember this, is that you're supposed, I had a very armsy swing where I was just swinging with my arms, but he's like, you're supposed to move your body towards the ball and your arms kind of hold on for dear life. And I just kind of feel that with like my children. Like I said, like I'm not swinging them with my arm. I'm not the one who's pushing them forward. I'm just holding on for dear life as life is happening and God is moving them and animating their lives. And right now, the things that happen in their life that make me go, oh my gosh, please stop doing that. Please don't do that yet. Please don't, yada, yada. It's like, well, I mean, it's happening and it is a part of a larger story. And it's my 19-year-old who understands that. She says it all the time. She's like, she's gotten a couple really shitty tattoos. And she's like, well, I don't like it, but it's part of the story. And I'm like, how do you at 19? Like, how do you at 19? God. How do you already at 19 have that perspective on life?
I'm not there already. I'd already be sitting here pissed as hell, being like, damn it, idiots! Like, what is wrong with me, Phil?
Right. I mean, we're sitting there talking at dinner at her birthday, and I'm like, the people shaping your life right now, I don't like them. I don't like these rappers. I watch some of the videos of like the hip hop artists that are influencing them. And I'm like, and I literally said, I'm like, I understand why they're the way they are. And I don't judge them for that. I understand why they talk that way. I understand that but I'm like, that's their life. That's not yours. And I feel like you're borrowing their life. And she's like, well, do you really think that when I'm 10 years from now, I'm going to be, that I'm still going to be thinking and acting and chasing these rappers like my 19-year-old self? And I'm like, who are you? Like, how do you, who has that kind of perspective on their own life? So that made me
I need to get your daughter on my show next.
Oh, like, how do you, so I'm like, you know what? You're going to be fine.
Wow.
Like
Yeah.
that voice that says God, that God knows how to name themselves when they encounter people. God knows how to introduce themselves to people. I'm like, okay, God will do it. It's always been God doing it.
There's something really phenomenal going on right now that really I am excited by. I think a lot of the world is terrified by, but I get excited by these kind of things. We're living in a time where kids are not being raised by their parents as they have been for the last tens of hundreds of thousands of years. They're being raised by like a global community in a sense, in that these kids are being raised on YouTube, TikTok, Netflix. Even if you ban your kids from watching it, they'll go to school and they'll watch it on their friend's phone or they'll talk to their friends. But there's an element where even if you are living in a racially segregated kind of community, maybe not officially segregated, but we all know that happens plenty. But you live in a white suburb, but guess what? Sitting on your phone, a huge portion of people are black or indigenous or whatever, or you are rich, but you're exposing yourself to poverty. You are straight, but you're exposing yourself to what it means to be a trans person in a way that, let's face it, we're about the same age or a little bit younger, and I'll hold that over your head for sure. But take anything I can get. But when we grew up, we were not exposed to that kind of stuff. We weren't exposed to the other sides of the world. We were exposed to, how many people our age, late 30s, 40, how many people at that age could tell you about a trans person in their school? Maybe a couple, maybe. Yeah. And it would have been like a huge deal and whatever. I talk to kids these days and they're like, oh yeah, cool. Yeah, I've got a couple of kids in our school. One of my friends is trans. So what's the big deal? Like, and you're like, well, I'm mind blown, not because they don't think it's a big deal and that's wrong. I'm mind blown because they don't think that's a big deal and it's such a huge progression. It's a great, wonderful thing in my mind. And I do wonder, there's probably all sorts of negative components to kids being exposed to so much, right? Kids, I mean, you're talking about 19-year-old watching rappers. I guarantee you, whatever your youngest kid is watching is probably going to be more terrifying.
For sure.
Like there's scary components to that for sure. Like there's no doubt about it. But it excites me a little. And do you have thoughts about this? I mean, especially I guess with race as well as being such a huge thing. It feels like race just falls apart. This horrible racism just falls apart when you start mixing people of different races in their upbringing, in their growth and things like that. It feels like there's a lot of hope potentially in racism almost naturally dying out. I don't want to remove the need for intentional anti-racist work. There's got to be a huge anti-racism movement if we're going to see any change anytime soon. But it does feel like the need for that in the younger generation almost kind of fizzles out because those lines are just not drawn as hard in the sand. Is what I'm saying making sense?
It makes sense. I think there's a yes and to that because my children experienced racism throughout high school. In 2000, from between 2016 to 2020, here in the United States, in dark blue California, right? Wow. So I think that, Dr. King talked about this notion of white moderates sort of believing that racism would sort of die out over time. And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but that it would die out over time and that if we were just patient enough. And I think that, like, to some degree, yes, Jay-Z mentioned this several years ago. It's hard for white kids growing up now to hate black people when they're listening to his music, right? When he's the person influencing them, when they're when hip hop culture is such a global phenomenon that, I mean, I was watching, I was watching Gangs of London, which I don't know if you've ever seen it or heard of it. It's an amazing show. So the Gangs of London, and I'm watching the show and there's like some, I think they're Persians and they're listening to hip hop. You know what I'm saying? It's like where hip hop went from being this just part of urban communities to, where you had BET and then you had MTV, and MTV was all rock all the time. And now I don't even know if MTV even does music anymore, but you know, like if you turn on the radio, any station, you're going to have hip hop that's going to come on. There's going to be a feature, even country music. It's like when Smith took over the Matrix, right? When Agent Smith was everywhere. It's what hip hop has done to the world. It is just permeated every culture, everywhere, all over the world. So from that perspective, I think there is some truth to the idea that things like that start to deteriorate, you know, the infrastructure of racism. But there's always been caste systems throughout the world. And those things, I'm not even sure they ever go away. Like, I'm not sure they ever completely die. I hope they do. I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime. But I do think this younger generation, to your point, is like just naturally making space where you and I, you know, I'm 42. I remember like I remember being very homophobic, and it was nothing to make fun of gay people when I was growing up in school. Absolutely. I feel awful, even though it's, you know, 30 years ago. I still feel terrible about it, but that's just like what it was. And so now to move 30 years into this present age, and you're like, it's not even a thing. They don't even like, it's nothing. Right. It's like,
and kids would like lynch each other over that. Like they would jump on you. If you as a kid in a school right now would like go, oh, that kid's gay, like, ha, like what I like, you know, threw out some slurs, or the rest of the kids in that school would turn around and be like, how dare you? That's just
for
okay.
Sure. Absolutely.
Which is such a like, it's the opposite dynamic. You know, it's almost it's cool to be inclusive, whereas like when I grew up, it was cool to be exclusive. Be as exclusive as possible. Pick on every other person. Right? It's wild. It's such a
they're more socially conscious now, I think, and I think you're right. I think the perspective of them being global. I think the fact that, especially like you look at TikTok or YouTube, and it's like you can see what's happening in some other part of the world, and Periscope literally even shows you where people are from if you're using Periscope. Right, so I think that you just kind of have this. The walls kind of broken down. Implicitly, there's still a lot of work to be done, because especially in the United States, a culture that you're still indoctrinated in, a culture that's telling you about American exceptionalism, right? And so you may actually be able to see and have an expanded view of what it means for someone to be an American, but you still have the caste system of America and this internalized sense of superiority that you gain from living in America, right? And having that. So the next generation will do I believe, a little bit more work to sort of fight that. But man, dude, I used to say this all the time, and, you know, it's like maybe a little bit of a pessimistic view, but, you know, I would say empire always wins, right? That as much as we like look at the expanding and the good and the Dr. Kings and the Gandhis and the Jesus and the Nelson Mandelas of the world, right? There are also the Hitlers and the Donald Trumps and the Osama bin Ladens and the, you know, all of those people who, you know, depending upon your perspective, you would view as proponents and advocates of evil. And they also keep evolving. You know what I mean? So
and in some ways compounding. So like the way they evolve, you mean, look at wealth, right? You look at certain terrible, horrendous, rich families that get rich off the back of like entire communities of black people, perhaps. And then you go forward 5 generations, and now they've got not 5 times the wealth, they've got 3,000 times the wealth, or, you know, and it's astonishing how much evil can compound as well.
And the things that support evil. Like I asked someone the other day, I asked everyone on my social media on Facebook, like, what makes someone an enemy? You know, because I've been wrestling with this notion of Jesus saying, love your enemy. And like, we have this, like a lot of Christians would be like, well, I don't have any enemies. Well, then you literally can't do what I believe is the most fundamental, the most fundamentally life-altering, amazing part of the faith you subscribe to, is that you are commanded to love your enemy. So if you can't identify an enemy, you can't do that. So I'm asking this question, right? And as I'm having really interesting discussions about it, one of my friends and I discussed, like, you know, it's interesting. Most people's answers to that question is someone who opposes me, right? It was never I oppose this person. So everyone's idea of enemy is, or adversary, is that this person is in the way of what I want to do. Well, sometimes you're in the way of what someone else wants to do.
Oh, yeah, and big time.
The reason why you're in the way of what someone else wants to do is because you both want that thing in the middle of the room, and you both believe if the other person gets it, they'll be superior to you. There you instantly have an enemy. And capitalism continues to create enemies. It continues to, as we talked about earlier, cause some people to believe if we let them in, they're going to take our jobs, they're going to take our work, we're going to have less money, we're going to have to change our lifestyle, we won't be able to live in this house, we'll have to move to a house down there. Oh, our property value went down because these people moved into this place. It's all of that. And that affects, again, religion. When you think about like churches, a lot of churches in the United States used to be in urban settings in the city. Well, with the invention of the automobile, people started going, I don't want to live where I work. I want to live out somewhere else. And so what happened? They moved out. The money moved out. Churches found themselves with nothing but poor people in and around their churches. And they went, well, we can't sustain this. So we're going out to the suburbs. And now you've got these suburban mega churches that are no longer serving in the communities where they're needed. Why? Because of advancements and capitalism. And that thing is so sinister, along with white supremacy, that even folks who mean well and want to change the way the world is arranged, if you do not start with those fundamental things, you may have the best of intentions, but at some point, capitalism is going to cause you to look across at someone who was your friend, like Captain America's Civil War, and you're going to be like, that is now my adversary. And that to me is what I go, I don't know what the answer is for that. I don't know what system there is that allows for the future to be a future where, there's space and we don't continue to have people become enemies because we're both competing for the same thing in the middle of the room.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, you don't even have to work hard to figure this out, right? You're asking the question like, who's your enemy? And my first thought is my wife. She might get the last bit of cheesecake, right? Or like it could be so simple, but that breaks down, right? There's one bit of cheesecake in the fridge and me and my wife are looking at it going, well, I'd like that cheesecake. And then we look at each other and it's like, okay, what's happening here? Now, hopefully we both go, oh, let's cut it in half. Or even better, like the others go, oh, you have it. You love cheesecake more than me. I'll have something another time. Or, right. Yeah. There's, of course, but there's still a thing in there. My brain is worrying, going, she's the enemy. Do not let her have that cheesecake. Exactly. You deserve the cheesecake. Exactly. The cheesecake is all. Like whatever it is.
Y'all really like cheesecake over there, man.
I'm a big fan. Actually, I'm not that big of a deal with cheesecake. My analogies always end up being something that's completely untrue anyway. So I don't think my wife likes cheesecake either. But so really, we're just looking at cheesecake going, no, we'll leave it. But, it doesn't have to be this big thing. On a very fundamental level, you put a toy in the middle of the room and you put two kids in the room and we know it's going to be World War III. And this doesn't have to be ISIS versus, Dick Cheney. This is, like whatever, whoever your perfect budding images of true enemies and warfare and qualified, attacking one another. We all do it. We all do it on every level. And it's huge. And I think you're right, because I think it will keep coming in. I think this is something that fascinates me. And I guess it's going back because I really want to touch on you kind of, touched on what I was talking about with the next generation being so different. But I think you hammer home so massively the implicit components of things like racism, classism, whatever is going on. I mean, there's this structure going on that is systemic that just doesn't get dealt with otherwise. And this is the thing with the explosion of, the Black Lives Movement this year just felt like it was taken to a whole nother level. But even in the UK, we had marches, it was blowing up. And I was, in my education, I was really intentional. I was like, I want to educate, but you know what? I want to educate here. I want to educate on my soil. Because I can, it's like I said, I moved to America and I'm like, Jesus, you guys are racist as fuck. Like, what the hell's going on here? I'm like, but it was interesting. It was, you guys are racist, right? It wasn't me. I wasn't racist. I'm from the UK. We're not racist. We're very integrated and we got this and we got that. And the truth is, it took me a lot of honesty and maybe quite a bit of fragility getting broken through to go, oh, whoa, we're really racist in this country still, and I am really racist still, and I'm going to have to own that, and I'm going to have to work on that. That's hard work. That's hard work to do. What do there's an element of like, okay, for people that start to wake up, for people that have a bit of intentionality, like I don't know why I woke up or why I stepped into intentionality when I wasn't intentional before. I'm just glad I did. And I couldn't even point the finger and go, that's what it was. It was listening to Jay-Z, or it was having a black friend, or whatever it was, right? I don't know what that was. There was something that pushed me across the barrier. It feels like if someone talked to me and said, hey, Phil, you know what? You're being racist right now. I'd go, oh, it would sting as like hell. That gut sink of like, oh, this hurts. But I would go, yes, almost definitely. Please tell me what's going on. How can I learn? But it feels like there's a huge portion of the population. You go, hey, you're being racist right now. And boom, explosion, defensiveness, whatever, that fragility component of, no one wants to be racist. No one wants to find out they're racist. But it feels like, so that's not the way to reach that person in a sense, right? Because, I mean, they can probably have that conversation 1,000 times. I mean, how many times has someone been called racist and gone, no, I'm not? It's not working. What do you think are the ways that we start breaking into the implicit components? And maybe they genuinely believe they're not. They're like, oh, I listen to black music. I've got some black friends. Maybe explicitly they're not that racist. Very possible. But it is deeply systemic. And it takes a whole nother... How do we, because I want to know as a white person, because this is not your job, right? And I know this is kind of your job because you talk about race, but this shouldn't be your job. Exactly. This should not be the job of black people to be educating on this. How do I, as a white person, help white people see the implicit components of this? Because it's easy to point out the explicit stuff. But that's flying less, right? And as we're talking about, maybe as society is moving forward, it's even if you want to be, you're not allowed to unless you're in America right now. But it's not as much a component. It just isn't going on. So how do we start highlighting that? How do we start reaching people? What would you say to that? Like how would you? I mean, I've read a bunch on this, and I'm still scratching my head a lot of the time and how to reach people.
I think it's space, man. I really think that inclusivity in space is, I say this all the time about contending for a better world. I think that is contending for a better world by creating more inclusivity and more space. I think I think one of the things that makes a person not feel safe or feel threatened by your racist, your xenophobic, your homophobic, is the threat of cancellation. Right. It's the margin. It's the very slim margin for error. I have non-binary friends. I have queer friends, and they've become more and more friends over the years. I still find myself really nervous that I'm going to get people's pronouns wrong, that I'm going to say something that is hurtful or harmful that makes a person feel unseen. There's a part of me that's still that I don't know that I fear being canceled, because I don't think I'm hold enough space in the world to be canceled, but I think that fear though of like being this person, it makes people retract into denial when they're confronted with the reality that they may carry some implicit ideologies that are harmful to other people. And when you can allow people to tell their story without judgment, which is a lot easier to do with white on white conversation than it is for some white person talking to me. Because some white person to me is going to be very reluctant to admit that their Aunt Susie at Thanksgiving used the N-word, but like in a community of people that's like committed to doing this forward progress work, it's a lot easier for them to say, yeah, my Aunt Susie's racist as hell. And this is what she said. And then here's where I agreed with her. Is that wrong? Like, can I and I think those conversations need to be, you've got to be able to have those conversations. We can't just throw people away because they were born into a system that reinforced maybe, I don't know if it's natural or not, but an inclination to want to be at the top of the caste system. Like no one who gets access to the green room thinks that everyone in the green room was a bunch of snobby ass, elitist. When you're in the green room, it's, oh, this is awesome, man. I was backstage with Justin Bieber and yada, yada, yada. But once you're out, if you ever get kicked out of the green room, then the green room sucks. Right. You know what I'm saying? So I think that there's just this, we have to hold space for people to change. And we need to do that in such a way that's safe for everyone, because there is a safe space for you to discuss race that may not be safe for a person of color to be in that same room, because some of the things that may be said may be triggering, may be harmful, may be hurtful. And I think that's the number one thing. I think white folks, educating white folks, doing their own work like you're doing, like sitting and listening, reading, listening to podcasts, reading articles, paying for some sort of education. There's like white homework out there that's out there available for people to learn. I know, speaking of racism, that podcast and that group of folks, and Check Your Privilege, those are all like resources for like anti-racism education, that these are people of color and some white folks that are like going, hey, we're going to dedicate our lives to doing this work of educating you. Those resources are available, but they're not just for you to consume. They're for you to take what you've learned and go to your family, those who are willing to engage in conversation, and like start listening to their stories, asking them questions, and trying your best to move them along. If some of them don't want to go, fuck them. But like most of them, I hope anyway, maybe I'm being way too optimistic, will be willing to sit and engage in a conversation if they feel like they're also being heard. I, though, am not the person to listen to your ideas about why Trump isn't racist. I ain't got time for that. That's not the space that I'm going to be in. I'm not sitting in racism 101 with folks and helping them walk through that kind of stuff, helping them to believe that racism is actually a thing. That is too much work, emotionally taxing. It is traumatizing to Black folks to have to do that work with white folks.
No, that's huge, and it's very helpful, and it's very encouraging as well, in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's good. Thank you. A lot of people have been really discouraged, and a lot of people have been very encouraged by this year as far as the topic of racism and anti-racism. It feels like this is clashing and coming to a head of the very worst, but also the very best. Do you have thoughts on where we're at right now and where we're heading as a society? Like, does this feel, because it just feels to me like if I'm not intentional, I just get so overwhelmed, and this is just the pits. Jesus, how far have we come? Even just like, the election, I'm sitting watching results come in, and I'm like, okay, I'm excited that there's a little bit more votes for the guy that isn't racist. But God, like, how is it just a little bit more votes? Like, how is there 70 million people that even if they're not saying we're voting for this guy because he's a racist, we're saying, well, but we're not going to not vote for him because of his racism. Exactly. Whatever that is, like that just, I literally grieved, despite maybe getting the outcome that I wanted. It was a really heavy process. So it feels like there's this heavy weight, there's the amount of we turn the TV on every day. There's another goddamn shooting or whatever, whether it's a school getting shot, whether it's another Black person, whether it's, police brutality, like just consistently. And it just feels so overwhelming. And yet it feels like more and more people are aware of this. I think the Black community has always been very aware of this, right? You guys have lived with that burden and that weight for so long. But I mean, I went to the march in Manchester. Don't think I've said that yet because, whatever. But I went to the march here in Manchester. I just don't like it's whatever. But the thing that blew me away was I've seen a lot of marches about race, and I've never seen a march about race that was so, multicolored. It was not just Black and brown people. There was so many white people there. Now, I don't know how many of them were there, virtual signaling or whatever, everyone can start getting negative or whatever, but that to me got me excited, right? Because you look at Martin Luther King, right? I mean, everyone wants to be like, well, yeah, Martin Luther King, we're us Christians were on the right side of shut up, right? White Christians wanted to kill that guy. White Christians did kill that guy, right? I mean, so but it feels like there is this awakening. I guess it feels like there is positivity there, but it's just so much crap as well. Like, do you have a feeling of a trajectory of movement of?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot. There were white folks that were aligned with Dr. King. I just read a book not too long ago, and I can't remember the data on it, but there was a certain amount of white folks that were present then there were white folks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think I saw the same thing you saw when it came to, protests across the world. You look at those protests and some of them didn't even have any black folks. It was like, so I think that like,
that was probably the protest up in Scotland. We're pissed off about this and we're inclusive, but we don't actually have any black people to march with, but we're going to march.
So I think you named something I think is important to name. I think we could all be like really skeptical, of the white moderate and the white liberals. And, there's lots of, language around that and sort of demonizing that group of people. Or we could say, there's some sort of forward movement happening, and that if, Paul would say, however the gospel is preached, I really don't give a shit. You know what I'm saying? However the message is however the message of inclusivity is being shared. I would say even if the people sharing it don't even really believe it, they're still sharing it, right? And that's just me. There are other folks that might be like, no, that's bullshit because yada, yada, which is fine. And they're entitled to have that thought. And I think, man, if you got like, people signaling that Black lives matter, that Black people have dignity, that it's not okay to just murder Black people in the middle of the street just so you have a badge, that, more than half the country saying we no longer want a white supremacist despot as our governing authority in this country. Like, yeah, I think the amount of people who waited in line to voted early, stood out in the cold to vote, like who risked their lives with COVID-19 to vote. Because anytime there's a huge turnout like this, it usually means people want change, usually. And that's what we saw, right? I think that there's never going to be, at least not in our lifetime, and I don't know, I don't see it in this age, where everyone is united around what good means, what hope and love and these concepts that we're all sort of fumbling through. No one's going to have universal agreement on what that means, right? So, of course, half the country still voted for Trump. And amongst those people, some of them voted for Trump because they themselves are explicitly racist.
Yeah.
Some of them,
without a shadow of doubt.
No, some of them voted for Trump because they were convinced that there's an immorality to some of the ideas by the liberal progressive Democratic Party. And they cannot see the world through any other lens. And, I'm in this really interesting season where I'm trying to be more intentional about not demonizing people. I feel like I've always done it, but I'm trying to be more intentional about it because when you start to realize that a couple people actually do listen to you, you start going, oh, well, I don't want to be responsible for people hating other people. I'm just telling the truth as I see it, but I don't want you to hate, because hate is too strong of an emotion for us to carry and sustain and keep and wake up every day with that thing. It will kill you. It will literally kill you. So I am like, you know what? I want to, as hard as it is, and as much as I know people are like, no, fuck that, I still want to offer grace to the Trump voter. I want to like offer grace to those folks and try to think maybe there's some other alternative way that they see the world, as twisted as I may believe that it is. There's got to be something to them because they're still human beings. So man, I it's a big old universe and planet. It's a bunch of people here, and perhaps, side note, I don't know. Can you imagine that like there's all these other planets and there's no one there? Like really, there's nobody anywhere else in the entire universe except right here on Earth. Like it just seems really odd to me. But like anyway, like of all of that, all that's going on, and it's so big and it's so massive that of course there's going to be mess. Of course it's messy.
Yeah.
It was always going to be messy.
No, it's huge. And I try to do that so much, is trying to humanize the other person, get in their shoes, understand, like, being in that evangelical world. I know you lived in an evangelical world, like how much, Christianity and evangelicalism is to vote Republican because, and the party line, whether it's true or not, because I don't think many people actually vote in that way for that reason. I think there's a whole bunch of other reasons. The party line is abortion. And I'm like, okay, well, for a lot of people I do know, that really is. They're like, I don't really like some of these policies, but babies are being murdered. And I'm like,
yes,
babies are being murdered. I could turn a blind eye to some really big issues if someone said, okay, but we're going to stop the baby murder bit, right? I'm like, yeah, okay, we could deal with some other stuff later, but babies being murdered? That seems a bit fucked up, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's not what the majority of Trump voters are voting for, but it's like, okay, so that person might be able to be reached. I could sit down with that person and maybe go, hey, let's talk about this a bit more, or whatever it is, right? Like, I think one of the stats that came out in 2016 after the election was that I think 67 or 68% of people that voted for Trump said one of the top 3 reasons they voted for Trump was because they had lost their job or were in fear of losing their job. And Trump had promised to secure their job. And I was like, you know what? I'd vote for a pretty shitty person if they guaranteed I wouldn't be starving next year when I'm really worried about it. I probably would. It's like what you're saying. What's the best shit option right now? And now the issue is maybe we should be sitting down and going, Hillary, why didn't you say to people that they'd probably be okay having their jobs? We made some problems or some miscommunications in that, but like, and again, is that the reason that they voted for them? Probably not exclusively, but it feels like there's a lot of humanity there, because I can imagine what it's like to be scared about losing my job. I've lived a good portion of a decade not having a static income, and every now and again going, well, this could get dicey. Like, that's a scary thought every now and again. And it's a very humanizing thought. Does it mean that I'm going, hey, it's okay that you're racist, it's okay that you're sexist, it's okay that you're whatever? No, of course not. But it is making me go, oh, I can understand why on some level that's not an issue for you because you're privileged enough to be a white male. So what is the issue for you? That you're worried about your job, that you're worried about a baby being murdered, that you're worried about X, Y. Yeah. I can understand why that's all encompassing for you.
Yeah. Those meta narratives are very easy to target and to like go, how dare you, right? But when you really get into the nuts and bolts of the story and the proximity that people have to starvation, the proximity they have to isolation, what it may cost them to decide to do the right thing, like, oftentimes, if you put yourself directly in those shoes, you can understand how someone didn't do the right thing, right? And that goes for every human being, which is hard for all of us. And it's really hard for Black and brown folks who continue to be on the pointy end of oppression to offer any sort of grace or compassion to the person holding that sword. Yeah. It's like, no, fuck you. And I think that's the power of Dr. King's words. It's the power of what Gandhi was about. It's the power of Mother Teresa. It's the power of Jesus. It's that, like, they were in the face of, like, the oppression and the evil in the world, decided not to allow the evil to permeate how they think and behave and act, but went, no, yes, I'm acknowledging that there is evil in the world, but I am not going to respond to evil by using evil's way of dealing with conflict. I'm going to deal with conflict from a totally different perspective, which is going to be this one that's subversive to power dynamics of beat down and crush and destroy. But it's going to be build and love and grow and move towards and understand and be compassionate. And we add to that now in our day and age, this idea of boundaries. And I think that's, like, again, that's what, like, I think that's the way human beings can live in a way that, like, is promoting the well-being of everyone.
Man, that's huge. That's really big. And it's so unfair, right? I mean, like, but that I guess is core fundamental grounds of the gospel, right? Message is it's unfair, right? Turning the other cheek or whatever. Yeah. But I deal with this with people, and not trying to draw a like for like comparison, but a similar comparison with a whole lot more privilege and a whole lot less cost. but people that are dealing with their family when they deconstruct, and maybe very religious families, and the families can become really toxic, and you're dealing with like your parents, and you're having to parent your parent. And it's like, this isn't fair. Like, someone in their 20s should not be having to handhold someone in their 50s in how to act as a healthy whole human being while they're struggling and in pain and worried about their life and not even knowing if they're like, if there is a heaven and if there is one, are they going there? Because they feel like they're probably going to tell. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And yet at the end of the day, to respond in the same way that their parents are responding is going to cease that relationship for a very long time. And so it's this thing of like, you are in the worst position of these two people. You are in the position of, potentially being oppressed, being hurt, being victimized. And yet it's on you to be the person that goes the extra mile, to be the person that takes the high roads and these kind of things. It feels very problematic to be talking about this sort of thing. It feels problematic to say to a black person to take the high roads when considering a Trump voter. Like, I mean, that's like these are tall orders. I'm a white person feeling uncomfortable saying something like that, and I'm parroting maybe someone like, Martin Luther King or Gandhi, both people of color, right? And I'm like, it feels really uncomfortable though. I don't know. Like, I feel like the white people should be taking more responsibility, but if they can't, does it end? Will it end? Like, I guess that's what I guess I'm hearing on some level. It's such a tall order, and it breaks my heart, if I'm honest.
It's a very tall ask, right? And it's an ask that I think too many white evangelicals make when they're talking about racial reconciliation. It's not your ask to make. You can't ask a person of color to take the high road. You can't do that. Like you don't get to do that to them. Yes. A person of color can ask, can suggest, because we understand what it takes to get to the quote unquote high road. But white folks have no business whatsoever trying to hold black folks to a standard of, hey, forgive me. An abuser does not get to say to the people they've harmed, you got to forgive me. In fact, if we see it depicted in a movie, imagine that you watch this film where this man is abusing a woman the entire film, and it ends with this man saying, "Well, you have to forgive me." We would be so outraged, like we'd be just fuming to see that. But this is what white folks have been trying to do when it comes to racial reconciliation, looking at black folks and saying, "You have to forgive." Nah, you don't get to say that. You're from the abusing class. Right? The abusing class doesn't get to you. You can ask for it. And then I, as the person who's been from the abused class, can say yes or no, I need time. And that is absolutely fair. Should be no questions asked. And you, as the abuser, should walk away and go, hey, I'll leave a lot on for you. In the meantime, I'm still like praying for, thinking about, sending blessing your way. Like that to me is proof that like I really do want reconciliation. I really do want there to be healing. Not that I want to dictate the terms of that healing. Like, which is what, again, we find so many white evangelicals who want to dictate the terms of it. Like, if you fired someone black from your staff because they were too radically black and you are not still paying their salary, you ain't trying to reconcile.
Yeah.
Like, if you ain't sent them any sort of financial recompense for the shit you did, don't tell me you're ready to reconcile, because you're not. Yeah.
No, and I've seen this in movements I've been involved with that have done some really fucked up racial stuff. I mean, really. And yet have then come out and gone, oh, we've learned that we have been, maybe not, and they never use the word racist because it's too loaded, but they would, some sort of weird way they would kind of say, we're trying to educate ourselves or something. And yet there's still fired staff. There's still people in that community that are struggling. There's still whatever, is going on in there. And it feels that, there needs to be a recompense. There needs to be an intentionality to be a part of a change.
There's a word for that. Another R word, reparations.
Yeah, reparations, big time.
There needs to be that happens when you recognize that, like, I have benefited from the abuse of other people. There needs to be something, I think, in your way of seeing the world and being in the world that says, man, how do I make good on this? It ain't charity. Like, I made a note a while ago, like, I need to stop thanking white people for being decent human beings. Like my friend Andre says this way. He says, if there's a toilet in the bathroom, I shouldn't thank you for not shitting on the floor. I'm not thanking you for that because there's a toilet there. So, like, I think the idea that like of again, you know, when there are white folks, as you mentioned earlier, virtue signaling, that, like, you know, I'm doing something gracious and generous. You're not being generous. Reparations is not the generosity of white people. Reparations is what white folks actually owe. It's a debt, and this is found in there's this ancient. I read this book once called The Bible as It Was, and it has all of these, like, writings that we never, you know, got to see because some European people decided what was in the Bible and what wasn't going to be in the Bible, right? And so there's this moment where some Egyptian goes to this older Jewish sage and says, like, you know, we want back everything that you took when you left Egypt. And this ancient, you know, wise Jewish sage says, yeah, okay, once, you know, we'll give it back, minus the 400 years of slavery and the wages that we were owed for that. Like, basically that whole idea of recompense, like, yeah, okay, yeah. Like, so let's not forget what it means to have, in the United States, 400 years of slavery, to have African people removed from their heritage, their customs, their ancestry, their religion, their spirituality, indoctrinated in a new way of being. And then after the quote unquote emancipation, there being this law that it's really illegal to be Black and outdoors. Yeah. And then you move into this whole era of the resistance so that we could just vote and drink water from the same fountain and sit and wherever we want to on a bus and go to whatever restaurant and school we want to and own property. That, like, that whole struggle, and that struggle sort of ends around 1970 something. And here we are just 40 years from that. Right. And like, you expect that Black folks without any dime from the government that says, hey, let us help rebuild what we tore down like we do in all these other countries we bomb. Come on, man. Like, what, like, what are we talking about? Like, there has, if reparations don't make sense to you, then I think there's more anti-racism education that you need to do. That's just me.
It's in the UK. I only found this out in my own studying, but in the UK, we finished paying slave owners for the slaves that they freed. The government basically paid for that to happen because the slave owners were, we're not giving our slaves away for free. We need money for that. And so the government was like, okay, well, and it was the biggest government bailout basically of all time in UK history at that point. And for even many decades after, it was the biggest thing in a long time. And we finished paying that in 2014. Jeez. People were still getting paid in 2014 for that. I don't know who, and I tell you what, no one's going to be putting their hands up to say, oh, it was me. Right? I mean, geez, that's when you keep your head low if you were getting that check every month or whatever it was, right? But Jesus, and I'm like, what the fuck? Like, this is crazy. But who's paying those slaves? Slaves get freed, and the question is not, how do we make recompense for this person being in slavery for so long, but having no opportunities and no starting opportunities at all? It's the people that got rich off that person's back, how do we make sure that they're paid what they deserve for the years in the future that they're not going to get? Like,
and how many white people have been recompensed since slavery, but we just can't quantify it because it wasn't an official government program. But
absolutely.
But we do have all these other ways that white folks have benefited. Again, it's like whether the government explicitly said, here's a check, or the system just said, hey, you have less competition for this because we're not going to let Black and brown folks be in this pool. So either way, you've got this benefit that's been happening that, you know,
only people get to go to university, only people that get to whatever, or even, we'll fund districts based on the income of that district. And then we'll only allow black people with no jobs to live in that area. And then their education will be just fantastic, I'm sure, compared to that area where, the average income's $100,000. Like,
exactly.
Jesus, how, like, and once you awaken to that, you see it. Like, once I see it, I'm like, oh my God, this is everywhere. And I'm pissed off. I am angry. And I cannot even imagine how angry I'd be with the boot on my neck. Right? I mean, this is me angry, watching from afar, going, oh yeah, and even angry at myself for being a part of that system. But I was completely blind to that system. I didn't even see it. Like, you
heard the alternative story, man. I mean, I think that's what, I think it's what it is. I think once you can't see what's, you can't see it until you see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I think that's just what it is.
Yeah. So, but it does mean that those that have woken up, at the end of the day, those people are generally speaking the ones that have least to lose. So they're probably not the billionaires, right? I was reading about I think it's the Cargills or whatever, Cargills. It's basically the secret billionaires. No one really knows about this family, but they're the biggest billionaire family in the world. And they have, I think, 135,000 employees around the world in 60 countries. And they have $1 billion for every 1,000 people they employ.
Jeez.
In this family of like 14 people, 14 billionaires. The family is hundreds and hundreds of people, and they are all multimillionaires, every one of them. And you read about how they got their wealth, how they went into Vietnam after whatever, and just like pulled it all out. It's wild. It's just
crazy, man.
It's really, really crazy.
I'd never heard about them.
But they're not going to be lining up to make reparations, right? But it's funny because, of course, if anyone could, right, they could be like, all right, let's just give like, I don't know, 500,000 to every black person in America, and that actually wouldn't bankrupt them, right? I mean, it's like that's the kind of money you're talking about. It's unbelievable. Anyway, dude, this has been absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for giving so much time. I really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate the work you're doing as well. If people want to dive into your stuff, like we mentioned your podcast, what are you doing and how can people connect to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way is probably go to CoreyEvanLeak.com. You can get to my Patreon through there. There's a Patreon community that I have of wonderful people who are supporting my work as well as just contributing to the work, through conversation. And it's also where I can do a little bit more, of intimate education with people and engaging with people. I can't really do that on social media as much. And of course, all my social channels, I'm on Instagram and the podcast on Instagram. I'm on Instagram. I'm also on Twitter. So yeah, that's how. And dude, Phil, I just really, really appreciate this time. It's been great. I'm honored to be on your show, talking to you and talking to your audience.
No, thank you so much, man. We'll definitely have to have another chat at some point for sure.
For sure. I'm into it.
Cool. All right. Love you, man. I'll catch you later. Yeah.
All right, dude. Take care.
Peace.